Let's get to it. If you drop a fragile glass cup on your kitchen tile, it shatters into 100 pieces. We accept this because we understand that certain materials behave in very predictable, unbreakable ways based on modern manufacturing limitations. But what if you were digging in your backyard, sifting through layers of prehistoric dirt, and you suddenly unearthed a perfectly functional microscopic computer chip buried right alongside Stone Age arrowheads? History books constantly tell us that human technology is a straight, entirely predictable line, a slow, grueling crawl from sticks and stones to the Bronze Age, all the way up to lasers and orbital rockets. But the deeper we dig into the archaeological record, the more that neat little timeline begins to aggressively fracture. We keep finding impossible things. We keep finding ancient machines that shouldn't exist. Stick around for number 1 on this list because a chilling glass-covered discovery in the Indus Valley completely changes what scientists thought they knew about ancient destruction. Number 12. The Huacha. Imagine standing on a muddy battlefield in the late 16th century. The ground is literally shaking beneath your boots as thousands of heavily armored samurai charge your defensive position. You don't have tanks, and modern artillery won't be invented for centuries. All you have is a wooden cart pushed through the mud by 2 terrified soldiers. But sitting on top of that cart is a tightly packed wooden rack filled with 200 hollow bamboo tubes. A single soldier steps forward with a burning torch and lights a master fuse. Instantly, the sky fills with a deafening roar, a blinding flash of ignited black powder, and thick trails of white smoke. This was the Huacha, an incredible invention of 15th century Korea that functioned as a highly lethal ancient multiple launch rocket system. A single 2-wheeled mobile cart could fire up to 200 explosive armor-piercing rockets in a single terrifying volley. Using meticulously crafted solid fuel boosters, known historically as Singji-yon, the rockets propelled explosive warheads with shocking range and devastating precision. When modern engineers and television myth testers recently analyzed the surviving historical schematics, they found that the aerodynamics of the paper and bamboo rockets were mathematically flawless. It wasn't just a haphazard fireworks display used to temporarily scare horses. It was a devastatingly precise payload delivery mechanism. The Korean military successfully utilized multi-stage rocketry and highly volatile chemical propellants centuries before the first modern artillery pieces were ever cast in European foundries. The sheer kinetic force of 200 iron-tipped rockets raining down simultaneously could shatter an entire advancing infantry line in a matter of seconds. Most historians agreed the Huacha was an unparalleled triumph of early chemistry and aerodynamic engineering, but realizing they mastered external rocket propulsion only raises a stranger question. How did ancient smiths mathematically manipulate the microscopic chemistry of the metal arrowheads themselves? To answer that, we have to dig into the frozen soil of Northern Europe. Number 11. The Ulfberht swords. In the desolate, freezing dirt of Northern Europe, a burial mound sat completely undisturbed for over a millennium. When archaeologists finally brushed away the soil and unearthed the Viking warrior resting inside, they found a magnificent sword clutched tightly in his skeletal hands. Etched directly into the glowing metallic blade was a mysterious signature plus VLFBERT. At first glance, it was just a beautiful relic, but the real shock came when modern metallurgists placed the weapon under a high-powered electron microscope. The weapon was forged from what we now classify as crucible steel. For a sword to be this incredibly dense, pure, and entirely free of microscopic slag impurities, the raw iron ore must be melted at temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The historical glitch here is massive. Europe wouldn't invent blast furnaces capable of reaching those blistering temperatures for another 1,000 years, arriving only during the peak of the Industrial Revolution. Yet somehow, between the years 800 and 1000 AD, Norse craftsmen, or whoever secretly supplied them with the ingots, were producing nanotechnology-level steel. The carbon content is so flawlessly distributed throughout the metal that the blade would bend where lesser swords shattered instantly, and it could slice through thick iron chainmail like it was made of woven linen. It is an artifact completely out of its own time. The leading explanation suggests Vikings imported the raw steel ingots from the Middle East via complex trade routes rather than forging the raw material themselves. But even if they bought the metal, how did ancient smiths hammer it into shape without ruining the temper? And before we can even solve that thermal puzzle, we have to look at an ancient weapon that turns solid steel into a liquid. Number 10. The Urumi. Imagine stepping into a duel where your opponent draws a sword, but instead of holding a rigid piece of iron, the blade suddenly droops to the floor like a wet ribbon. At first glance, it looks like a complete joke, almost like a prop from a theatrical play. Then, with a violently fast flick of the wrist, that ribbon whips through the air, cleanly severing a thick wooden pole in half before snapping back into a tight, shimmering coil. Originating deep in the Indian subcontinent, the Urumi is an ancient weapon that completely defies traditional metallurgy. It is a sword with a blade so incredibly thin and flexible, it functions entirely as a liquid-like metal whip. Sometimes wielding up to a dozen continuous blades attached to a single wooden hilt, highly trained Kalarip-Hayatsu martial artists swing this weapon in a continuous, swirling dome of razor-sharp steel. Creating a weapon like this requires an absolute, almost magical mastery of metal tempering. If the steel is heated and cooled too quickly, it becomes brittle and shatters instantly upon impacting a shield or bone. If it is tempered too soft, it won't hold an edge and simply bends into useless crumpled shapes. The ancient Indian smiths had to achieve a perfect paradoxical balance of heat treatment, creating a specific alloy that flexes like rubber but retains an edge sharp enough to easily sever limbs in a single strike. Researchers today believe the secret lay in highly localized, temperature-controlled quenching techniques passed down purely through oral tradition, but the exact thermal recipes remain frustratingly vague. How do you permanently lock liquid flexibility into rigid iron? But this incredible discovery created an even bigger mystery. How do you force an ancient metal to completely stop aging? Number 9. The Sword of Goujian. In 1965, an excavation team in China's Hubei province was digging through a damp, heavily flooded underground tomb. Wading through knee-deep muddy water, they found a wooden box completely saturated with centuries of wet rot. Inside sat a beautiful bronze sword resting tightly in a lacquered scabbard. When an archaeologist carefully unsheathed the weapon, expecting it to crumble into brown dust, they gasped. It was not rusted. It wasn't even lightly tarnished. It looked like it had been freshly forged that very morning. This is the Sword of Goujian, an artifact officially dated by researchers to be over 2,500 years old. When modern scientists cautiously tested the ancient blade, it effortlessly cut through 20 layers of thick paper in a single smooth swipe. The true mystery emerged during intensive chemical analysis. The ancient weapon's pristine condition in a highly corrosive watery environment wasn't a lucky fluke of nature. The ancient Chinese smiths had somehow coated the blade with a microscopic, flawless layer of chromium sulfide. Chromium extraction is an incredibly complex, highly toxic metallurgical process that requires extreme heat and highly specialized chemical knowledge to successfully bind it to metal as an anti-corrosive shield. In fact, this precise chromium plating method wasn't officially invented or patented by modern science until 1937 in Germany. Yet here it was, perfectly preserved in a tomb from 500 BC. Some metallurgists fiercely argued the chromium presence might be a naturally occurring trace element in the local bronze ore, naturally amplified by the airtight lacquer of the tomb. But the incredibly uniform thickness of the chemical coating make that highly unlikely. And this ancient chemical mastery wasn't just used for preserving small blades, it was about to be weaponized on the open ocean. Number 8. The Turtle Ship. The year is 1592. A massive armada of heavily armed Japanese warships is advancing aggressively across the water, completely confident in their absolute naval superiority. Suddenly, pushing through the thick, salty morning fog, a terrifying silhouette emerges. It has no massive sails to burn. It has no exposed wooden deck for archers to target. It is a massive, lumbering galleon covered entirely in hexagonal armor plates, with a giant, snarling dragon's head carved right into the heavy wooden bow. This was the Gyubik Sun, universally known to history as the Korean turtle ship. Exactly 300 years before the American Civil War supposedly debuted the world's first ironclad warships, Korean Admiral Yi Sun-sin designed an impenetrable floating fortress. The sweeping roof of the vessel was completely covered in interlocking iron plates, bristling with hidden sharpened metal spikes to instantly impale any invading boarding parties that tried to jump onto the hull. But the most terrifying feature was the dragon head. It wasn't just decorative artwork meant to scare sailors. It was an advanced chemical warfare dispenser. Below deck, hidden from view, soldiers burned a highly toxic mixture of sulfur and saltpeter, using a complex leather bellows system to pump blinding, choking chemical smoke out through the dragon's mouth, suffocating enemy gunners just before the turtle ship rammed them into matchsticks. Naval historians still marvel at the complex buoyancy calculations required to keep a top-heavy, iron-plated galleon from instantly rolling over in the rough ocean waves. But before we fully understand how they calculated the physics of armored watercraft, we have to look at an ancient device that calculated the mathematics of gravity. Number 7. The Roman dodecahedron. We are taking a sharp turn into the bizarre here. Imagine walking into a high-tech modern military base, bypassing the tanks and the advanced drones, and finding a small, oddly shaped bronze paperweight sitting right on the commanding general's desk. You ask what it is, and nobody in the entire building has a clue. This is exactly how top archaeologists feel when they unearth the Roman dodecahedron. Found scattered widely across the outer, heavily militarized edges of the former Roman Empire, these objects are deeply confusing. They are hollow, 12-sided bronze geometric shapes. They feature perfectly circular holes of varying sizes on each flat face and small, rounded knobs protruding from every single corner. There is absolutely zero written record of their existence. Not a single Roman text, ledger, or military manual ever mentions them. Mainstream historians often classify them lazily as knitting toys for making winter gloves or perhaps ornate candle holders for wealthy merchants. But military engineers have a much darker, highly mathematical theory. They propose these were highly advanced optical rangefinders. By looking through the varying holes and aligning the knobs with a distant target, a Roman artillery unit could mathematically calculate the exact parabolic trajectory required to launch a massive boulder from a catapult and accurately crush enemy walls from hundreds of yards away. The academic debate remains deeply polarized between a domestic crafting tool and a ballistic supercomputer. Some researchers point to their precise mathematical ratios as definitive proof of military application, while others disagree entirely, claiming Romans wouldn't cast tools out of valuable bronze. What do you think? A simple toy for knitting socks or a highly weaponized calculator? Let me know your theory below. And speaking of ancient ballistic mathematics. Number 6. The Gastraphetes. Imagine an ancient battlefield where foot soldiers are standing firmly behind massive walls of solid, glittering bronze shielding, feeling entirely secure. The enemy line is hundreds of yards away, far beyond the lethal reach of a traditional wooden bow. Then, with a sickening, violently loud crack that echoes across the valley, a massive wooden bolt shatters the bronze shield and pins the screaming soldier directly to the dirt. Long before the modern sniper rifle, the ancient Greeks of 400 BC invented the Gastraphetes, translated literally from the ancient texts as the belly shooter. This was not a normal handheld crossbow that you see in medieval movies. It was so massive and required so much terrifying kinetic tension that a strong soldier couldn't possibly load it with his arms alone. Instead, the weapon featured a sliding, heavily ratcheted wooden stock. The ancient sniper had to plant the heavy nose of the weapon securely into the ground, rest his stomach against a crescent-shaped wooden brace, and push down forcefully with his entire body weight. This utilized the brutal physics of torsion, storing terrifying amounts of kinetic energy into tightly wound sinew and carved wood. When the trigger was finally pulled, it delivered armor-piercing lethality at distances that completely defied the accepted physics of the era. Engineers today have successfully rebuilt the Gastraphetes, proving it was a triumph of mechanical engineering that completely shifted ancient combat parameters. They essentially built a machine to harvest raw human kinetic energy. But what happens when ancient craftsmen start harvesting their raw materials directly from the void of outer space? Number 5. King Tut's meteorite dagger. In 1925, the famous British archaeologist Howard Carter was carefully unwrapping the ancient, tightly bound mummy of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun. Tucked deeply within the thick linen bandages, strapped tightly to the dead king's withered thigh, Carter discovered a stunning, perfectly preserved dagger. The handle was exquisitely carved solid gold, but the blade was dark iron. And in a civilization operating squarely in the middle of the Bronze Age, an iron blade of this quality was scientifically impossible. For decades, the dagger was considered a profound anomaly that historians simply ignored. Ancient Egyptians primarily used copper and bronze, materials that melt at roughly 800 degrees Celsius. Smelting pure iron requires a sustained, agonizing temperature of over 1500 degrees Celsius, a strictly impossible thermal threshold with ancient Egyptian kiln technology. In 2016, modern researchers finally solved the mystery using highly advanced X-ray fluorescent spectrometry. The blade wasn't terrestrial. The chemical signature revealed unusually high levels of nickel and cobalt, perfectly matching the exact elemental composition of a meteorite discovered near the Red Sea. The ancient Egyptians had literally scavenged a shooting star from the desert sand and hammered its alien metal into a blade fit for a god. One interpretation proposes that the metal was meteoric iron simply cold-hammered over months into a blade shape, completely avoiding the need for extreme melting temperatures. But the microscopic precision of the blade's symmetry still heavily puzzles experts. And if forging space rock wasn't terrifying enough, another ancient culture was busy engineering microscopic biology. Number 4. The Scythian whistling bioweapons. You are standing on a dusty plain in Central Asia in the 5th century BC. The horizon suddenly darkens with a massive horde of nomadic horsemen. Before you even see their faces, the sky fills with a sound that freezes the blood in your veins, a chorus of high-pitched, screaming wails raining down from the clouds right before the men around you start dying in excruciating, bubbling agony. The Scythians were legendary mounted archers, but they didn't just rely on sharp flint to win their brutal wars. They explicitly engineered arrows with specialized, aerodynamically drilled holes in the bone arrowheads. As these arrows sliced rapidly through the air, they acted as horrific wind instruments, creating a terrifying, screaming wail that induced mass psychological terror. The ancient world's equivalent of the Stuka dive bomber siren. But the awful sound was only the distraction from the real threat. Historians have uncovered horrific physical evidence that Scythian shamans dipped these whistling arrows in an engineered biological nightmare. They synthesized a highly toxic mixture of rotting snake venom, putrefied human blood, and animal feces. If the physical impact of the arrow didn't kill you instantly, the microscopic biological payload guaranteed massive infection and gangrene necrosis within hours. Toxicologists today confirm that snake venom mixed with the specific bacteria from decaying organic matter would act as a devastating, rapid-onset biological agent. Was this simply a crude, lucky hunting tactic, or a highly calculated understanding of microscopic pathogens long before the official modern discovery of germs? I'm curious where you land on this one. But while the Scythians weaponized sound and sickness, the Chinese were weaponizing pure mechanical speed. Number 3. The Zhuge Nu. Imagine trying to reload a heavy musket in the blinding heat of battle. It takes almost a full minute of pouring black powder, ripping paper cartridges, and ramming heavy lead down a barrel while the enemy charges directly at you. Now imagine facing an opponent from 2,000 years earlier who simply pulls a wooden lever back and forth, firing a continuous, blinding hail of iron-tipped death. In the 4th century BC, brilliant Chinese engineers developed the Zhuge Nu, widely known to history as the repeating crossbow. It completely shattered the mathematical limitations of ancient warfare. Unlike a standard slow-loading bow, this sophisticated weapon featured a top-mounted, gravity-fed wooden magazine that securely held 10 heavy iron-tipped bolts. By pushing and pulling a single, beautifully engineered wooden lever, the soldier could cock the tense string, drop a new bolt perfectly into the firing chamber, and shoot, all in one fluid, lightning-fast, one-handed motion. A moderately trained average conscript could easily empty all 10 bolts in just 15 seconds. It was the ancient world's precise equivalent of an automatic assault rifle, utilizing lever-action mechanics and gravity-fed systems centuries before the West ever conceived of such designs. Military historians eagerly note that while the repeating crossbow lacked the armor-piercing kinetic punch of heavier siege weapons, its sheer, terrifying rate of fire made it an unmatched defensive tool. But before we fully unpack how they mastered rapid fire, we have to look at a machine that could literally lift a ship out of the ocean. Number 2. The Claw of Archimedes. The year is 212 BC. The massive, highly disciplined naval fleet of the Roman Republic is forcefully assaulting the towering coastal walls of Syracuse. As the mighty Roman warships row aggressively up to the defensive seawall, expecting a standard fight, they aren't met with a normal volley of arrows or fire. Instead, a colossal wooden arm descends rapidly from the sky. A massive iron hook grabs the wooden front of the warship, and the entire 50-ton vessel is violently ripped entirely out of the water. Known widely as the Claw of Archimedes, this unbelievable superweapon was a towering, crane-like defense system designed by the legendary mathematician himself. Operating from behind the sheer safety of the tall city walls, hidden defenders would swing a massive wooden beam outward, dropping a heavy grappling hook directly onto the attacking Roman quinquereme. Through an incredibly advanced, totally hidden system of compound pulleys and massive lead counterweights, a few men pulling ropes could harness impossible leverage. They would physically hoist the bow of the heavy Roman warship high into the air until it hung completely vertically. Then, a sudden, quick-release mechanism was pulled, dropping the ship with such violent kinetic force that it instantly capsized or snapped completely in half upon hitting the waves. Modern engineers have actually built incredibly accurate, functioning scale models of the claw, definitively proving that Archimedes' understanding of structural mechanics and pulley mathematics was flawlessly accurate. It was an ultimate physical defense mechanism. But physical destruction of wood and iron is one thing. Atomic-level destruction of an entire city is something else entirely. Number 1. The Mohenjo-daro glass epicenter. In the ancient Indian epic known as the Mahabharata, there are haunting, highly specific descriptions of an apocalyptic superweapon called the Brahmastra. The ancient text describes a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe, creating an incandescent column of smoke and flame brighter than 10,000 suns, leaving unfortunate victims with suddenly falling hair and poisoned food. Mainstream history comfortably tells us this is purely mythological poetry written by imaginative storytellers, until we looked closely at the dirt. At the vast archaeological site of Mohenjo-daro, nestled deep in the Indus Valley, researchers unearthed a chilling, highly disturbing scene. Skeletons were found lying directly in the ancient streets, holding hands, seemingly struck down instantly by a sudden, unimaginable, catastrophic event. Strangely, these fragile remains showed absolutely no signs of bladed weapon trauma, and bizarrely, they had not been scavenged by wild animals. But the most staggering piece of physical evidence lies deep in the soil itself. At what appears to be the exact geographical epicenter of the ruined city, archaeologists found ancient clay pottery and mud bricks that had been completely melted and fused into solid chunks of green glass. This strange material is visually and chemically identical to trinitite, the radioactive glass formed by the extreme thermal flash of the atomic bomb test in Alamogordo, New Mexico. Fusing standard stone and sand into glass requires a sudden, highly localized flash heat of over 1,500 degrees Celsius. Most archaeologists strongly suggest this terrifying melting was the result of a highly concentrated yet natural chemical fire, or perhaps a localized meteorite airburst exploding directly over the city. But solving the heat puzzle only reveals a much deeper, unsettling question. How perfectly does an unpredictable airburst align with ancient texts describing a weapon that deliberately poisoned the earth with a brilliant, world-ending flash of light? We look at human history as a clean, highly predictable ladder where every single generation is slightly smarter, slightly faster, and significantly more advanced than the last. We like to believe that progress is a straight line. But when we pull shining swords from muddy swamps that refuse to rust, uncover steel forged in impossible fires, or find ancient sprawling cities scorched by unearthly heat, that comfortable ladder begins to look more like a shattered puzzle. These unbelievable weapons remind us that ancient minds weren't primitive, stupid, or waiting for us to figure things out. They were brilliant, desperate, and remarkably dangerous. If you want to keep exploring the fractures in our history and the incredible mysteries buried right beneath our feet, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There's always another puzzle waiting in the dirt, and we're just scratching the surface. See it in the next one.